The white horse is Pegasus, the flying white horse with the god riding him and slaying the dragon. Well, what do you think Lone Ranger is? What do you think Hopalong Cassidy is? They ride into a dirty western town wearing these beautiful clothes, wearing a beautiful bowline saddle and gun belts and silver everywhere and this beautiful hats. But it's so funny. They ride into the town and nobody notices.
We are talking today with Marc Wanamaker, who has a podcast called The History of Hollywood with Marc Wanamaker, and he's right here. Marc, welcome.
I'm very pleased to be here. I talk about the people that are forgotten who actually started this business. We hear about Carl Laemmle's and Louis B. Mayer's and all that, but what about, all these little guys, like these tiny little producers like Joe Rock Productions. I mean, nobody's heard of any of this because they were the Poverty Row producers. So let's go way back to the very beginning, 1909, when the first studios were coming to Los Angeles. First one was the Selig Polyscope Company of Chicago. Came out here in 1906 and 7, made the first films out here, built the first studio, purposely built studio in Edendale, that's an area north of downtown, and built it in the sense that they love the culture of early California, so the studio is designed as the San Gabriel Mission with bells and the belfry, everything. And what did they make there? They made everything, but Westerns was the staple, starting with the Great Train Robbery in 1903, made in New Jersey. But little by little, the first stars of Westerns, George Barnes. Who's George Barnes? He was the star of the Great Train Robbery. There's a famous scene in there, in which real history and film history kind of combine, in which he looks straight at the camera, pulls his gun, and shoots directly at the audience. Freaked people out.
And wasn't that tinted, colorized too?
They did colorize a lot of the shooting. In other words, when they're shooting, you can see little puffs of yellow, color coming out. This is amazing. This is 1903, Edison Film Company.
Mm-hmm. Bronco Billy was in that too, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. Bronco Billy, which was Max Aronson, was in it. First Jewish cowboy, Bronco Billy Anderson.
Not the last, though.
Not the last. But interestingly, George Barnes, in this famous scene, shooting the gun, was recreated in The Gray Fox.
Oh, yes.
With Farnsworth, right? Mm-hmm. And in which this train robber gets out of prison, and he's in this town in 1903, sees a picture show. What is that? He goes into the picture show, and when George Barnes shoots, he shoots back. Get this, because I'm a king of real history and fake. That actually happened. Whoever wrote that, either they had to know about it. I found a clipping in 1903 of a guy who stood up in the theater and shot at the screen at George Barnes. Now, if that isn't the mixture of real and mythology of the West, what is?
Yeah, it's movies.
So the Poverty Row is born from this kind of thing. So the Bison Film Company of New York, they were a company that was formed by these guys who thought they needed some novelty. They wanted to do some films of Westerns, because Westerns was the big deal in 1908, 1909. Remember, we had Lubin Company, S&A Company, Biograph, Edison. They were all making Westerns. Now, Westerns in those days, there were no B-Westerns. B-Westerns means it's the second, film to play with the feature and all that kind of stuff. But in my mind, a B-Western is something that is shorter, cheaper, quicker, and more fun. Serials were B-Westerns or B-films, which were all put in order like TV shows, episodes. So let's go back to the Bison Company. It was formed by these guys who hired two real Native American Indians, Red Wing and James Youngdeer. They had a vaudeville act. She made her wonderful Sioux costumes, beaded. She was a genius at it. They had a very successful career doing this live. And then they found them and said, we have an offer you cannot refuse, to write, produce, star in, direct your own films about Indian
Native
life.
Americans were offered that.
Yes. This is because at the time in 1909, You have to understand the Indian Wars ended in the 1890s, with Wounded Knee and all that. So 1909 and 1890, that's nothing. So it was on people's minds. But there was the wrong, impression that most white people in the United States hated Indians. You always think of a good Indian is a dead Indian. But it's not the case. People loved the Indian culture, American Indian, Native Americans, whatever you want to call it. That's why Buffalo Bill, Pawnee Bill, and all these Wild West shows since 1880s and 90s were doing so well. They loved this culture of the West.
Sitting Bull with the Buffalo Bill.
Sitting Bull. There's real history and film history, right? So anyway, the Bison Company started making these films in Staten Island and in Fort Lee, New Jersey. Look, people know where they're shooting these films. They know it's not the real West. So finally, the Selig Company is already in California. Let's send them out to the real West. And they sent them out in 1909. They decided to take over a little ranch in Edendale, which is today North Los Angeles on Glendale Boulevard, owned by the Hornbeck family. And the young Bill Hornbeck was there, this kid, and he was so excited. Movie people are coming to his little horse ranch. And they started to make the films there in Edendale area, which is not far away from later Mixville. And that's this part of East Hollywood, North Los Angeles. It was all rolling places, horses. It was the West, but near downtown, okay? Trolley cars were going there. So you could jump on a trolley, go right to the Bison Film Company.
Horses were still the main mode of transportation.
People were still drawing
The roads
horses.
weren't paved in most places.
No, not paved at all. This was the real West, but it was changing dramatically. So the Bison Company was headed by a guy named Fred Balshofer. And Fred was a producer, director, jack of all trades. So he decided, it wasn't called B-Westerns then. Let's do these kind of formula Westerns. And what did he buy? A white horse. Okay, I am the expert now on what are these white horses in Hopalong Cassidy and Lone Ranger.
And Buck Jones.
Buck Jones, Silver.
Called Silver, yes.
And many, and others. Well, he bought a white horse called Snowball. And the first actor to ride this white horse was Art Accord.
Wow.
Now, they didn't wear these fancy outfits, of course. They wore real Western stuff.
Now, wasn't Art Accord like a mean son of a...
He was a real cowboy. And he was a drinker, a fighter, a carouser. And he wasn't the most handsome man in the world because his nose has been busted about a million times. But he really took to being in the film industry. He was authentic.
And the audience took to him.
Yes. Well, he was authentic. And he's a hero and all this, riding the white horse. Now, what is the white horse mythology? Is Pegasus. The white horse is Pegasus, the flying white horse with the god riding him and slaying the dragon. Well, what do you think Lone Ranger is? What do you think Hopalong Cassidy is? They ride into a dirty Western town wearing these beautiful clothes, wearing a beautiful bowline saddle and gun belts and silver everywhere and this beautiful hats. But it's so funny. They ride into the town and nobody notices. You check the reality at your seat there. And, of course, they save everybody and do everything, and they're all good and wonderful and all this kind of thing. Well, this started here with Fred Balshofer and Art Accord. Of course, it's silent films. You don't hear them swearing.
Was this before William S. Hart?
Yes.
But about
way
the same
before.
time as Bronco Billy Anderson was doing.
Later is Bronco Billy.
Wow.
This is early stuff. This is archaeology of Poverty Row Westerns.
I love that.
Okay. So they were doing this, and Lubin Company came to town. They had a contract with Buffalo Bill, but Buffalo Bill was too busy with his West shows and everything, so there was a look-alike, but he looks exactly like him, probably his cousin, and I have a photograph of them standing by the Lubin studio in East Hollywood in 1910, I think it was. There's some cowgirls there, because I'm getting into, wait a minute, who are these cowgirls? One of them is Jane Bernuti. Who's Jane Bernuti? I didn't know about Jane Bernuti until the name seemed familiar. And because I'm an expert on Thomas Ince, the father of the Westerns, the proper way that Westerns are done with real shooting scripts and everything. Well, he had Inceville, which is now Santa Monica, the Coast Highway there and Sunset Boulevard, where Gladstone's for Fish is. That was all a movie studio. The Miller Brothers 101 Wild West show, which they leased. Thomas Ince leased them. And so they had real Sioux Indians there. They were doing these things. So Jane Bernoulli was there, but I didn't know this because I found a card. It was the Inceville Association, 1912 to 1940. They had an association of people that worked at Inceville. Charles Ray was there. William S. Hart was born there at Inceville. That's when it all started in 1914. I mean, it's way later than all what we're talking. So the culture, in other words, of the B-Westerns, the stuff with the white horse, the hero, the films are not... Remember, Hart wanted to make longer films, features, which he did, but the B-Westerns stayed shorter and cheaper, and later developed or morphed into a whole different industry within the film industry. And this is the beginnings of Poverty Row.
Wow.
You know, I just saw a film with Sammy Baugh. Sammy Baugh.
Slingin' Sammy Baugh.
Slingin'.
Yeah,
He was a football player. Yeah. I saw a serial he did. And who is this guy? He looked great. He was born in Texas. He rode horses. He shot.
Could he deliver a line?
No.
Okay.
He spoke in it. He had the worst voice. He had a little Texas accent, but you can't understand what he's saying. He's not enunciating properly. And his acting was so wooden, you wouldn't believe it.
I got to see some.
You have to see it. I saw the serial. I saw all of them. And I was very disappointed. I liked him. But that's why he didn't continue. And Duncan Rinaldo was his sidekick in this. Yes, Duncan Rinaldo, who I love the Cisco Kid.
Me too.
I met him years ago because I was a stunt kid at Corriganville. But I met a lot of these people, but I didn't know who I was really meeting at the time. I was just a little teenage kid. But all of this was leading me, when you say, you know, interested in the West and B-Westerns, it is a part of me now. I knew Ray Crash Corrigan. I knew Colonel Tim McCoy. I worked there. I met these people. I knew Jay Silverheels. But now, years later, it's hitting me hard that I knew these people, and now I'm seeing why they were so important, because of this industry within the industry. They had their own directors, own studios, own writers, own wranglers, own everybody, and then many actors, as we see over and over again, appearing in everybody's films.
Now, how did the films survive, these low budget things? How were they even distributed?
No, that was a great question. How do they survive this thing? So they survive because this industry within an industry needed a product for all the tiny little Nickelodeon and tiny little theaters all through the United States and Europe. Now,
because they were silent, sure. They just changed the interstitial cards.
And do you know that all through Europe saw these films back to the teens? And the Europeans fell in love with the Western genre.
And they thought that that's how the United States still was.
Yes, they did in many ways. But let me tell you, by the 1920s, they started to make some films on their own, Westerns. Norwegian Westerns, Spanish Western, English, French, and German Westerns, okay? What does that mean? They're not making these films on a regular basis. They made them once in a while in homage to the American films. So what did they do? I've seen these films. They're hilarious. So they didn't have cowboy hats, so they got a Three Musketeers hat, took out the feathers, and it's a sombrero.
And turned it
and whatever. Their boots were military boots from Swiss military or whatever, cavalry, right? So they cover them up, and then they have Indians there. So they watched all the Indian films, so they copied the teepees. They kind of put feathers and stuff on and leather.
Well, Karl May, who much later did Old Shatterhand and Winnetou, had never been to the United States, and he made up all this stuff, but yet was a best-selling author. And then, of course, those films in the 60s, prior to spaghetti westerns, were huge, and there's still a big following for all of those.
Look, it's the American film culture of the Westerns. To this day, they're still making Westerns now, is still
and we love that.
TV.
And the Westerns are back. But let's get back to
we
the
have
late
to go
20s.
We'll go back to the 20s now.
And find out. We know who the great ones are because we know all about them, and we see their films. It's Tim McCoy, Buck Jones, Harry Carey, Tom Mix, William S. Hart. What about, like, the Art Accords? Who were some of the worst that were out there?
Well, Jack and Al Hoxie were big. No, who's heard of Hoxie? I mean, Hoxie, who's this?
Well, even Yakima Canutt.
Yakima Canutt.
He was a big star in the silent
He
films.
was named after, you know, the rodeo where he came from in Yakima, Washington.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, he goes way back, too.
But he looked great.
Days.
He just didn't have a movie star voice.
No, he didn't.
No.
Harry Carey did carry on. Stage actor. William S. Hart.
Had retired already before talking.
He had to. I've heard him speak. And he was a Victorian stage actor like DeMille and all the rest of them. They all knew each other. And he would speak like this. And the West was wonderful. Seriously, he would speak this way. It just did not translate to modern audiences. It was crazy. It was horrible. That's why he quit.
Thank you.
Thank you for letting me share this new knowledge that nobody's ever heard of yet.